In 1513, an Ottoman admiral drew a map. On that map, in the correct position with the correct shape, is a landmass that European explorers would not officially discover for another 307 years. The map is not lost. It is not disputed. It is sitting in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, where it has been since 1929. The admiral wrote notes on the map explaining where he got his information. Those sources have never been found. The Piri Reis map is one of the most examined historical documents of the 20th century. It has been studied by the Library of Congress, by the United States Air Force, by historians at universities across 3 continents, and by cartographers who have spent careers trying to explain what it shows. Piri Reis was not a forger. He was not a fantasist. He was Hagji Muhyiddin Piri ibn Hagji Mehmed, an Ottoman admiral, cartographer, and navigator whose geographical knowledge was so respected that his sailing manual, the Kitab-i Bahriyeh, remained in use for over a century after his death. He was executed in 1553 on the orders of the Ottoman Sultan, reportedly for insubordination. His map survived him. The map, now known as the Piri Reis map, was drawn in 1513 on gazelle skin parchment. It was rediscovered in the Topkapi Palace in 1929 during a cataloging project. A historian named Halil Edhem found it folded inside a pile of material that had not been examined since the palace's conversion from imperial residence to museum. It had been sitting there, unexamined, for an unknown number of decades. When cartographers began analyzing it, they found something that should not have been possible. I came across the Piri Reis map while researching something else, the history of the Library of Congress map collection. I was looking at how the library acquired historical maps in the early 20th century when I found a reference to a 1960 letter from a cartographer at the library named Arlington Mallory. Mallory had spent years analyzing the Piri Reis map and had reached conclusions that he described, in his own words, as incompatible with any conventional explanation of how 16th century cartographers could have obtained this information. Mallory was not a crank. He was a trained engineer and cartographer who had spent his career working with precision maps. His analysis of the Piri Reis map was conducted with the same methodology he would have applied to any technical document. His conclusions were not accepted by mainstream academia. They were not refuted either. They were, largely, set aside. I pulled every academic paper written about the Piri Reis map between 1929 and today. There are more than you would expect. The conclusions vary. The anomalies do not. The Piri Reis map covers the Atlantic Ocean and the coastlines bordering it, the western coast of Europe and Africa on the right side of the map, and the eastern coast of the Americas on the left. In 1513, European knowledge of the Americas was limited. Columbus had reached the Caribbean in 1492, just 21 years before the map was drawn. Vespucci had reached the South American coast. The Pacific had not yet been crossed by a European. The interior of the American continents was entirely unknown. The Piri Reis map shows the Caribbean with considerable accuracy, consistent with what Spanish explorers had documented by 1513. It shows the eastern coast of South America with accuracy that exceeds what Spanish records from that period would have allowed. And at the bottom of the map, extending across what would be the southernmost portion of the Atlantic and into the area we now call Antarctica, there is a landmass. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, when a Russian expedition under Fabian von Bellingshausen became the first documented European contact with the continent. It was not mapped with any precision until the 20th century. The first detailed survey of the Antarctic coastline beneath the ice was completed using seismic technology in the 1950s. The landmass on the Piri-Reis map corresponds, in its general position and in several specific coastal features, to the coastline of Antarctica, particularly the coastline of Queen Maud Land, the section of Antarctica facing the Atlantic Ocean. The correspondence is not perfect. Historians who have examined the map disagree about how precise it is and about whether the landmass represents Antarctica at all, or a misplaced representation of South America, or a theoretical southern continent that medieval geographers had postulated without evidence. What they do not disagree about is that the landmass is there, that its position is approximately correct, and that no conventional explanation of 16th century cartographic knowledge fully accounts for its presence. The most important evidence about the Piri-Reis map is not what it shows. It is what Piri-Reis himself wrote on it. The map is covered in annotations, notes in Ottoman Turkish explaining the sources Piri-Reis used, describing the coastlines depicted, and commenting on the reliability of his information. Those annotations have been translated and studied extensively. In one annotation, Piri-Reis describes the sources he used to compile the map. He lists several, including maps made by Christopher Columbus, which he says he obtained from a Spanish sailor who had sailed with Columbus. He describes Portuguese charts of the African coast. He describes Arab geographical sources. And he describes what he calls very old maps, ancient charts, he writes, that dated from a time before the current geographical knowledge, which showed coastlines and land masses that his contemporary sources did not describe. Very old maps. Piri-Reis does not specify where these very old maps came from. He does not name their authors. He does not describe their age more precisely than very old. He treats them as authoritative sources, reliable enough to include in a map he was compiling for the Ottoman Sultan. Those sources have never been identified. No map or chart that could have served as Piri-Reis's ancient source for the southern landmass has ever been found in any archive or library in the world. The annotation exists. The source it describes does not or has not been located. In 1960, a copy of the Piri-Reis map was sent to the United States Air Force Cartographic Unit at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts. The request came from Arlington Mallory, who had been corresponding with a historian named Charles Hapgood at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Hapgood had been studying the map for years and had developed a specific technical claim that the southern landmass on the map corresponded not just approximately, but precisely to the subglacial coastline of Antarctica, the coastline as it exists beneath the ice, which had only been mapped using modern seismic technology a few years earlier. The Air Force analysis was conducted by Harold Zeed Ohlmeyer, a lieutenant colonel in the cartographic section. His response, in a letter to Hapgood dated July 6, 1960, is one of the most quoted documents in the history of the Piri-Reis controversy. Ohlmeyer wrote that the Air Force cartographers had examined the map and found that the southern coastline depicted corresponded to the seismic survey data of the Antarctic subglacial coastline with an accuracy that, in his words, was remarkable. He wrote that the map suggested the coastline had been surveyed before it was covered by ice, and that the ice sheet covering Antarctica was estimated by geologists to have formed approximately 6,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Ohlmeyer concluded his letter by stating that the Air Force could not explain how this information had come to be on a 16th century map, and that the question of its origin was an enigma. An enigma. That letter exists. It is in the public record. A United States Air Force cartographic officer examined the Piri-Reis map using modern seismic data and could not explain what he found. The mainstream academic response to the Piri Reis map has been, for the most part, cautious dismissal. The most common academic explanation is that the southern landmass represents not Antarctica, but a misplaced or distorted representation of the southern tip of South America, that the map's projection, which is centered on Cairo and uses a system that distorts distances and shapes at the edges, has displaced Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego into a position that superficially resembles an Antarctic coastline. This explanation is reasonable. It is also incomplete. The distortion argument accounts for the general position of the southern landmass. It does not fully account for the specific coastal features that Hapgood and Ohlmeyer identified as corresponding to the subglacial Antarctic coastline. It does not account for the scale. The southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is significantly larger than Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, even accounting for the map's projection distortions. And it does not account for Piri Reis's own annotation describing very old maps as his source. If the southern landmass is simply a distorted South America, derived from Spanish and Portuguese charts of the period, there is no need for ancient sources. The contemporary charts were available. Piri Reis used them elsewhere on the map. The annotation about very old maps refers to something else, something whose origin Piri Reis himself did not explain, and whose identity has never been established. The academic explanation accounts for the anomaly partially. It does not account for it completely. And in cartographic history, partially is not the same as fully. The Piri Reis map is not unique. It is the most famous of a category of historical maps that show geographical features inconsistent with the documented state of European geographical knowledge at the time they were drawn. The Orontius Phineus map, drawn in 1531, shows Antarctica as an ice-free continent with river systems and mountain ranges. The rivers and mountains correspond, in general terms, to the subglacial topography revealed by 20th century surveys. Orontius Phineus was a French mathematician and cartographer, respected, documented, working in Paris. His map was not considered anomalous in his own time. It was simply filed and forgotten. The Boucher map of 1737 shows Antarctica divided into two landmasses by a sea, a feature that corresponds to the subglacial topography of the continent, which is indeed divided into two major landmasses by a subglacial channel. The channel was not known to exist until seismic surveys in the 1950s. Boucher drew it in 1737. The Haji Ahmed map of 1559 shows North America and Asia connected by a land bridge in the area of the Bering Strait. The land bridge that geologists believe existed during the last ice age, approximately 12,000 years ago, and that was used by the first human inhabitants of the Americas. Each of these maps has a conventional academic explanation. Each explanation is partial. Each map contains features that the conventional explanation does not fully account for. The question these maps collectively raise is not whether any single one of them proves the existence of an ancient advanced civilization. That is a conclusion that goes beyond what the evidence supports. The question they raise is simpler and more precise. Where did the cartographers of the 15th and 16th centuries get information that they should not have had? Piri Reis said he got it from very old maps. The other cartographers did not always specify their sources. The sources, where identified, lead to earlier sources, which lead to earlier sources still, and the chain eventually ends not in a known archive but in a gap. Something was known, something was recorded, the record was used, and then, at some point before the historical record begins, the original source disappears. The most likely repository for ancient geographical knowledge accumulated over centuries or millennia of navigation and exploration, was the Library of Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria was not a single building. It was a research institution, the Mouseion, that collected manuscripts from across the known world beginning in the 3rd century BCE. At its peak, it is estimated to have held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, the accumulated written knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world and beyond. It did not burn in a single catastrophic fire, despite what most people were taught in school. The standard story, Julius Caesar burned it in 48 BCE, is disputed by ancient sources and almost certainly wrong. Caesar did burn ships in the harbor, and fire may have spread to some warehouses containing books. But the library as an institution continued to function for centuries after Caesar. What actually happened to the Library of Alexandria is more complicated and more interesting than a single fire. It declined gradually over several centuries through reduced funding, political instability, the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, and the associated closing of pagan institutions, and a series of events including a decree by the Emperor Theodosius in 391 CE ordering the closure of all pagan temples, which may have included the Mouseion. The scrolls did not all burn. Many were dispersed to private collections, to other libraries, to monasteries. Some ended up in the Arab world, where they were preserved and translated during the Islamic Golden Age. Some ended up in Byzantium. Some ended up in locations that have never been identified. The geographical knowledge of the ancient world, the accumulated records of Phoenician, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman navigation spanning thousands of years, was in that library. Some of it survived in the works of Ptolemy and Strabo and Herodotus. Some of it survived in fragments cited by later authors. Some of it may have survived in the form of maps and charts that were copied and recopied across centuries until they reached the hands of a 16th century Ottoman admiral who described them as very old and used them to draw a map that showed a continent nobody was supposed to know about. Where the originals are today, if they still exist, is not known. The man who spent the most sustained effort trying to understand the Piri Reis map was Charles Hapgood, a history professor at Keene State College in New Hampshire who devoted 20 years of his life to the question. Hapgood was not a cartographer by training. He was a historian and a generalist, the kind of scholar who follows questions across disciplinary boundaries, which made him both more productive and less credible in the eyes of specialists. His 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, remains the most comprehensive analysis of the anomalous historical maps ever published. It presented his detailed cartographic analysis, the Air Force correspondence, comparisons with seismic survey data, and his broader theory that the maps reflected the geographical knowledge of a pre-Ice Age civilization capable of global navigation. That last conclusion, the ancient civilization, was where Hapgood lost most academic historians. The maps themselves were anomalous. The civilization that made them was speculative. Critics argued reasonably that Hapgood had established the existence of a puzzle, but had then leapt to a solution that went beyond what the puzzle required. Hapgood accepted this criticism to a degree. He continued to refine his analysis until his death in 1982, killed by a car while walking near his home in New Hampshire. His papers were donated to the Library of Congress. They are publicly available. They contain his complete analysis, his correspondence with the Air Force, his cartographic calculations, and his notes on sources he was still pursuing at the time of his death. The notes on sources he was pursuing include references to archives in Istanbul, in Cairo, and in the Vatican that he believed might contain the original maps Piri Reis had used. He never got to those archives. Whether anyone else has is not publicly documented. The Piri Reis map is in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. You can go and see it. It is displayed in the Imperial Treasury, behind glass, in a room that also contains the sword of Suleiman the Magnificent and the mantle of the Prophet Muhammad. It is approximately the size of a large poster. The gazelle skin parchment has darkened with age. The coastlines are drawn in careful lines. The annotations in Ottoman Turkish cover the margins and the open sea areas. The southern landmass sits at the bottom of the map, solid and specific, in a position where no 16th century cartographer should have known to put it. Here is what is certain. Piri Reis drew a map in 1513 that shows a landmass in the position of Antarctica. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. Piri Reis wrote on the map that he used ancient sources whose identity has never been established. The United States Air Force examined the map in 1960 and found that the southern coastline corresponded to subglacial Antarctic topography with an accuracy they described as remarkable and could not explain. The academic explanation that the southern landmass is a distorted South America is partial but not complete. Charles Hapgood spent 20 years analyzing the map and died before reaching the archives he believed held the answer. The very old maps Piri Reis described have not been found. They may be in Istanbul. They may be in Cairo. They may be in the Vatican. They may have been destroyed in one of the innumerable fires, floods, conquests, and purges that have eliminated so much of the ancient world's written record. Or they may be somewhere that nobody has thought to look, in a collection that has not been cataloged, in a library that has not been fully digitized, in a box that has not been opened since the last person who knew what was in it died. The map exists. The sources do not. The coastline is there. The explanation is not.